and welcome to another episode of GreenFleet Talks. My name is Kate Armitage and I'm your host for our discussion today. And I'm delighted to be joined once again by Richard Parker, Corporate Sales Manager at Webfleet Solutions.
Hi, Kate. Nice to see you
Hi,
again.
Richard. Good to see you. So today, Richard, you and I are going to be discussing the growth of electric vehicles and what more needs to happen in the transition to mass market.
Yes.
The latest figures from the SMMT show that battery electric vehicles and plug-in hybrids reached 17% share of new vehicle registrations in July, which is great news. And what would you say are the main reasons that the sales of EVs have picked up pace?
Yeah, well, there's a couple of reasons, Kate. I mean, the first one, I think it's the last 18 months, people have taken stock of their lives and what's going on. I think that's flowed into, if you look at, this summer, you can't, if you've watched the news at all, you can't help but see the extreme weather events going around and be a bit blind. You'd be a bit blind to not think that there is a genuine climate emergency going on. And I think lots more people are now reflecting on that and making changes from a decarbonisation perspective in terms of their daily lives. So that requires procurement of not just cars, but other aspects of sustainable living and things like that. So I think that's one aspect. I think the other aspect is, from an OEM perspective. If we look at, October of last year, there were about 19 EV models for commercial vehicles on the market. Where we sit here today, there's about 34. So within 12 months, we've doubled the number of actual electric vehicles from the manufacturers available for business use. So I think that as well is contributing to this, starting to see this significant uplift above diesel sales as we've seen in July's SMMT figures.
Yeah, I agree, and vehicle choice, particularly for vans, has been a bit of a sticking point for quite some time. So it does feel like we're on the brink of quite a big change, and this
I think so,
and as you've said, these social and environmental implications are being really understood now by people at every level of society and within businesses, which again can only be a positive thing.
Absolutely.
So I'm gonna flip that question on its head a little bit, because whilst I do genuinely think that 17% is great, it is still only 17%. And we still have a long way to go before plug-in vehicle registrations dominate market share. And certainly with this 2030 ICE ban looming, how are we going to make up that 83% gap? So my question to you is, why are businesses still choosing ICE over EV?
I think there's a number of reasons. I think that we have to accept that there isn't product there for the whole business use as we sit here at the moment. We know that, for example, 4x4s, we know they're on the horizon, but as we sit here today, they're not there and ready for that kind of business use where that's the case. I think, we have got pricing, and I think there's a lot of businesses still out there that make their procurement process through a very simplified financial model, whether that just be the purchase price or if you lease them, effective leasing. Whereas we know that EVs need to make sense on a total cost of ownership model as the pricing sits there today. Total cost of ownership models which take account of the running costs as well as the procurement cost of the asset itself really is where businesses need to sort of get to in terms of making sure that model stacks up. I think the other part that businesses really need to do is to truly understand the operation of their fleet and what it does for their business. Quite a number of the fleets I speak to have a perception of what the fleet's doing and yet don't have real insight from whatever data source that is to truly what is the operating model for the business. And I'll give you an example. When I worked in fleet, quite often the drivers would say, oh yeah, I do 22,000 miles a year, average numbers. And when it came down to looking at the actual numbers, that might have been 15 or 17,000. So the perception versus reality is something that business need to get hold of it and understand where their business is today, here and now, and not where they think it is. And that might just facilitate some ability to move and start the transition. Because again, that's an important word. This is a transition, and it's not changing your whole fleet on day one, but it's having the knowledge of what's going on and starting the process.
And it's confidence, isn't it? To be able to say to your senior manager or the board of directors, based on this data and insight,
absolutely,
this is what we're proposing, rather than gut instinct or relying on your drivers to tell you when they're ready to make the switch.
And I think some of the fear is comes from the fact that we're talking about power and energy, and most businesses are used to going to a petrol station. They understand how that works, and I think from my perspective, the messaging, certainly with the work I'm doing, is the community that is around this whole transition. And actually there is a lot of people who can introduce the businesses to the other aspects of change through electrification, whether it's the power that's needed and etc. So I think that my message to them is reach out to the people that that are involved in EV, and they will help facilitate you to the rest of the people that you need to be talking to make sure that transition is easily and smoothly done.
I agree. This is a pretty well-trodden path now, isn't it? We're not looking for trailblazers. We're just, look at what the fleets before you have done, take that expert advice, be guided.
Yeah. And more so than ever, those fleets are willing to share their experiences, and actually there's a lot of work. I mean, I'm working with one of the leading councils at the moment, for example, as well. And everything they're doing will feed back in through to Innovate UK, which will then be shared with the other councils. So those trailblazers, they're still out there in many aspects, because we know that we don't have all the answers yet. We know that, there's still things that will need to be addressed, such as on-street charging, and the fact that 40 to 60% of commercial fleets may not have access to home or depot charging. We haven't quite worked those through, but these organizations are working them, and the information will feed back and be shared. So it's just a case of looking at where it's been done and taking that best practice.
Yeah, agreed. I just want to pick up on something that you mentioned, because well, first of all, I've just got to say, 4x4s are quite often cited as a bit of a sticking point. That we're not going to make our 83% gap up from them. So that, I think let's focus on what we can do, not what we can't do, because there's a lot to go at. But the total cost of ownership and that upfront price, if you do outright purchase, is still a barrier. But at some point in the future, we're going to reach price parity for EVs.
Yeah.
So, how soon can we expect that to happen?
So from all the things I read, price parity should happen when I believe the price per kilowatt hour reaches £71. So creating a battery, £71 per kilowatt hour of battery for the battery development is roughly where now. Now, from what I read, we're looking at 2023 potentially being that period. So, as you've said, how we're going to get the 83, 2023 is really, really close.
It is close.
It is close. It is close. And if we do arrive at that position, and, I think, much of the OEM production will come from consumer and business demand as well. I think, if businesses and individuals stop buying the other vehicles and they want those, then I think the OEMs will react to that. And I think it's a bit of a chicken and egg on some respects for those at the moment. But I think consumer demand invariably leads to change from manufacturers.
Well, it's holding up well so far, but the sooner the prices come down, the better.
I agree.
And again, you've already touched on this, but it's not surprising that every time we have a conversation about zero emission fleets, there's a lot of focus on the choice of vehicle and
Mm-hmm.
the car itself, and then some discussion about the recharging equipment.
Mm,
But what are the other aspects that businesses need to consider when
okay.
switching to EV?
So I think there's five for me, five key ones. One is the stakeholders involved in the decision to actually transition to electric vehicles. So in a traditional fleet environment, you might have HR or facilities involved, but now we're entering a phase where actually those responsible for the utilities and the tariffs, and so actually, when you're beginning to consider the move is really make sure you understand what stakeholders within your business are part of that decision making process and not just assume it's the usual sort of project team that will be brought together in terms of any fleet policy change. I think we've mentioned the charging patterns, but those charging patterns also will now not only include your business use vehicles, but your employees. As we open up after lockdown and more people come into the office buildings again, more and more of those individuals will have their own EVs under private ownership. And so that will lead to potentially thinking about the future proofing of your car parks to do that, because you don't want to be digging up the tarmac twice in a few years, but also actually how the charging works on a day-to-day basis. Now, a few of the businesses I've spoken to are starting to run this almost like they run meeting etiquette, and you can have book the charger for a certain amount of time. If you're late, tough, you still have to leave the charge at the end of that point. So that's quite an interesting development in terms of future proofing through the car parks and how they're going to be worked. Employee support. Driving an EV is somewhat different if you're going to maximize the efficiencies of that EV than an ICE vehicle, and the things you can do to increase the availability of range under the given driving conditions. So again, the number of Oxford, who I'm working with, for example, have a really good program, and I know SSE do as well, in terms of before a driver gets into that first EV, there's a retraining of this is how you do it, because for most of us, last time we had driver training, if you haven't got points or anything else, was when you passed your test. It's a very different world. So again, I would encourage people to make sure that they understand that as people get into their first EVs, the right support and training is there to get the most out of those vehicles. And I guess finally, it's around servicing network. And we know, again, this is transitioning for a lot of the servicing networks, and we know that EVs perhaps don't need as much in terms of servicing. There's not as many moving parts. But it's equally important that when you're looking at your geographical distribution of EVs, that actually the servicing network can support what the downtime, because if you're running a commercial fleet, what you don't want is days and days off the road because you can't get the vehicle serviced in line with the requirements or repaired. So again, those are sort of 5 areas that I would say, outside of the usual ones, make sure that you're in your project plan, you're understanding how that's going to work.
Well, they're all quite big subject areas, and you're not the first person I've spoken to who has highlighted the importance of the employee buy-in and just spending a little bit of time on that driver training, either before the employee decides to switch to plug-in or when the vehicle's being delivered. My experience is it's actually very easy to organise. There's no rocket science, and the feedback from the employees is almost entirely positive in that it's a great driving experience, and any slight hesitation and nervousness that they may have had disappears very quickly. So it's really not a quick win, but a very valuable activity to make sure you've got that buy-in.
Absolutely. I'll give you an example. I mean, I did some work with a client a few years ago now, actually, and they were looking at a dip test of 6 electric vehicles. And we actually put a couple in for the drivers to use, and they ended up with 48. Just because it's that once you've driven it, a lot of people say you'll never go back. You'll never want to go back once you've driven an EV. And I think that's a key part of the engagement of the employees in bringing them on board is almost the trying of it and making sure those vehicles are trialed properly.
And if you do that induction properly, they become your ambassadors. and
Absolutely.
they will effectively recruit your next wave of EV drivers,
Absolutely.
with their enthusiasm and passion. So yeah, all good stuff. Uh, so quite a long list of things that businesses need to do, and it's well discussed. Not everything is within the control of the business. So we so outside of the business, I'm just thinking about local authorities and the role that they need to take to ensure the maximum take up of EVs in their areas. What do you think the local authorities should be? Where should they be focusing their efforts?
So I think there's a number of different areas actually. So if we look at the bold moves making a bold move such as Oxford going zero emissions in October in the city centre. Now, not all of the answers are known about, in terms of the infrastructure and everything else, but actually there's a stake in the ground there and people will react. And if you keep kicking the can down the road, we'll never get there. So, I doff my cap to Oxford for that kind of approach, and I'm working with them closely on a number of different areas, and actually the research and their energy to put that back to wider local authorities, I think will be amazing when that starts to come back. So they're trying all sorts of things, some of it working, some of it not, and I think having councils prepared to take that challenge and run with it, I think will benefit wider councils. I also think there's a number of councils, Nottingham, Coventry, just to name a couple, I think Leeds are as well, who are actually giving businesses the opportunity to try EVs for an extended period of time at no cost, and that's funded by Highways England. So that's a great initiative in a few areas as well, where we'll see, I'm sure local businesses taking EVs that wouldn't have taken them because they didn't want to take the leap of faith. And here they are, they can test the water and make sure it works. And I think that's really kind of the limit of it for me at the moment in terms of what I understand. I think it's incredibly difficult, I suppose, coming out of the pandemic as we are, knowing budgets are certainly something. The work I'm doing with Oxford, every conversation is a budget conversation as well, given everything that's gone on. So perhaps it comes back to the OEMs as well, making sure that these vehicles become cheaper as well.
Yeah, which we've discussed with the price parity, and I think my recent line of thinking, Richard, is slightly different, because I think what local authorities need is budget for resource to put policies in place, to engage with the public charging infrastructure providers, because actually I think the money will come from the private sector. I think that that money is there. We've seen it recently with Shell announcing that they'll provide the local authority element of the funding for their on-street chargers. But the local authorities really need to be coordinating and leading and doing this work in their own fleets and understanding what the timelines for the delivery of these things, and like Oxford trialing all these initiatives.
I also think some of it is potentially, sorry to cut across, I think some of it as well is around the knowledge that's sat within the council as well. It's almost, the same as in other businesses. Actually, there is very little experience in the local authorities for actually undertaking such infrastructure change.
I think the funding for local authorities almost needs to be on, we need experts, we need to build up, a team is maybe a bit strong, but a pool of resource, potentially across multiple authorities, and have a few more joined up regional plans.
I agree.
And with a brief to getting as much private sector funding as they possibly can.
And it's the challenges of off-street parking as well, isn't it? How they get past them, and I think was it 25% of UK households don't have any off-street parking. It's all off-street parking, without any driveways. It's the innovations like that. I mean, I've seen something in Oxford actually where they're digging a channel under the pavement and putting a grate over it so the cable can be run directly from the house. So, and these are all new things that people are trying. And
Oxford have been doing a lot on the on-street residential, and we've spoken to a couple of companies who are working on that trial. And again, it's just facilitating that insight. The OZEV on-street residential charging fund, which is really generous, 75% of the cost. Actually had a very low take-up rate originally, and I do think it's because the local authorities haven't got the expertise or struggling with other priorities within their own areas to actually make it happen. So it's not always about money.
No, I agree with you, and it will be interesting to see over the coming years just how clean air zones develop again, and come back on the agenda. And we know Bath and Bristol are pushing forward again in that respect.
Yeah.
So
Birmingham's gone live.
Yeah, exactly.
And of course, you've mentioned Oxford already. I mean, I think the pandemic, in that sense, did set the world back, but.
It was almost like a firebreak chance, wasn't it, for everyone just to step back and have a look. And when we get the extended ULEZ zone in London as well, I think there's a number of localized initiatives that are kind of underpinning actually the wider 2030 legislation. I think perhaps we'll see more of that accelerates the change, and we say picking up that other 83%.
Well, let's hope so. Thank you, Richard. It has been a pleasure talking to you again. That is about all we've got time for. Yeah. So I would like to say thank you to Webfleet Solutions for joining GreenFleet Talks, and thank you for watching. Please tune in to GF365 again soon.
Thank you, Kate.
Thank you, Richard.